Are you trying to improve your English but find reading boring or too difficult? Don't worry. Listening to stories can make learning fun and easy. Let me tell you a story that will help you learn and enjoy at the same time. Chapter 1, A New Journey Begins. My name is David, and my story begins on a bright morning in June 1751. That day was special. It was the last time I left my father's house in 𝘚𝘌𝘍𝘢. My good friend, Mr. Campbell, was waiting for me. "I'll walk with you to the river," he said kindly. We walked quietly for a while, neither of us speaking. Finally, Mr. Campbell broke the silence. "Are you sad to leave 𝘚𝘌𝘍𝘢?" he asked gently. I thought for a moment and replied, "I don't know, sir. I don't know where I'm going or what will happen to me. I've been happy in 𝘚𝘌𝘍𝘢, but I've never been anywhere else. My mother and father are gone now, and I must go and find my future." Mr. Campbell nodded and told me something surprising. "Before your father died, he gave me a letter. This letter is your inheritance." He took the letter from his coat and handed it to me. "Your father asked me to give you this and send you to the House of Shaws near Edinburgh. That is where your father's family came from, and he wanted you to return there." I looked at the letter. It was addressed to Mr. Ebenezer Balfour, House of Shaws. Below the address, it said, "This letter will be brought by my son, David Balfour." I was shocked. I had never heard of the House of Shaws before. I was only 17 years old, and suddenly, I felt nervous and scared. A new chapter of my life was beginning, and I didn't know what to expect. Mr. Campbell gave me a warm smile and said goodbye. I turned back to look at 𝘚𝘌𝘍𝘢 one last time, the place I had always known and loved. Then, with a deep breath, I turned towards Edinburgh and walked into the unknown, ready to face whatever lay ahead. On the morning of the second day, I climbed to the top of a hill. Below me, I saw the city of Edinburgh and the sea stretching out behind it. Ships floated on the water, their sails glowing softly in the morning light. As I walked closer to Edinburgh, I saw a group of English soldiers in bright red coats marching down the road. I watched them for a moment before continuing my journey. When I reached the city's edge, I began asking people for directions to the House of Shaws. To my surprise, everyone I spoke to looked at me strangely. At first, I thought it was because I looked poor and tired from my long walk. But as time passed, I started to feel something was wrong. Why do people seem uneasy when I mention the House of Shaws? I wondered. Before, I had imagined a grand house filled with wealthy relatives waiting to welcome me. But now, doubt crept into my mind. Perhaps the House of Shaws wasn't the place I thought it would be. Despite my worries, I knew there was only one way to find out. I kept walking. Finally, as I crossed into the next valley, I saw it, the House of Shaws. It was nothing like I had imagined. The house stood alone, old and worn, with crumbling walls and broken windows. There was no gate at the entrance, no path leading to the front door, and the chimneys stood silent, no smoke, no warmth. It looked abandoned. By the time I arrived, the sky had darkened. The house loomed before me, cold and empty. No lights shone from the windows. I stood there for a moment, staring at the dark shape before me, wondering what kind of future awaited me behind those silent walls. I knocked once on the large wooden door. I waited, but nothing happened. I knocked again. Still, there was no answer, but this time, I was sure I heard someone moving inside. Frustrated, I began kicking the door and shouting, "Mr. David, open the door." Suddenly, I heard a sound above me. I looked up and froze. A man was leaning out of an upstairs window, holding a large gun pointed straight at me. "It's loaded," he warned coldly. "I have a letter," I called out quickly, trying to stay calm. "It's for Mr. Ebenezer Balfour." The man narrowed his eyes. "Who are you?" he asked, the gun still in his hands. "I'm David Balfour," I replied, my voice steady but my heart racing. There was a long pause. The man seemed to be thinking. Finally, he spoke again, but this time, his voice was quieter. "Is your father dead?" he asked. I nodded. "He must be dead. That's why I'm here." The man sighed and said, "I'll let you in." The door creaked open, and I stepped inside the dark, cold house. "Let me see the letter," the man demanded. I hesitated. "The letter is for Mr. David," I said firmly. "Not for you." The man stared at me for a moment and then replied, "I am Mr. David. I'm your father's brother, your uncle." I stared at him in disbelief. I had no idea my father had a brother. Without saying much more, my uncle led me to a small room. It was dark and empty, with only a thin mattress on the floor. "You can sleep here," he said. Before I could respond, he pushed me inside and locked the door behind me. I felt a lump in my throat. I was tired, cold, and confused. I wanted to cry, but instead, I lay down, closed my eyes, and soon drifted into a deep, exhausted sleep. Chapter 2, Secrets and Silence. The next morning, I knocked on the door and shouted until my uncle finally let me out. We sat at a small table, and he placed some bread and cheese in front of me for breakfast. Uncle Ebenezer barely said a word. He avoided looking at me, his eyes fixed on the floor or the walls. Every now and then, he asked me a question, breaking the long, uncomfortable silence. "Where's your mother?" he asked quietly. "She's dead," I replied. He nodded slowly. "She was a beautiful girl," he murmured, almost to himself. The day dragged on like this, long stretches of silence, followed by strange, short questions from him. I grew impatient. I wanted to know more about the letter my father had left and what inheritance I might have. But whenever I brought it up, my uncle changed the subject or pretended not to hear me. Finally, I gathered the courage to ask him something that had been on my mind. "Who was the eldest brother, you or my father?" I asked carefully. My uncle's reaction shocked me. He jumped to his feet, his eyes wide with panic. "Why do you ask that?" he barked, grabbing the front of my jacket. I stayed calm, though his grip was tight. "What do you mean?" I asked, holding his gaze. "Let go of my jacket." He hesitated but eventually loosened his grip and stepped back. "Don't ask me about your father," he said in a low, shaky voice. I clenched my fists under the table, frustration bubbling inside me. My uncle's strange behavior and refusal to answer simple questions made me uneasy. For the first time, I began to think he might be mad, or worse, dangerous. Later that night, Uncle Ebenezer surprised me. He placed a small bag of coins on the table, 37 gold pieces. This was a lot of money, far more than I expected. "Why are you giving me this?" I asked, eyeing him suspiciously. "What do you want in return?" He smiled faintly. "Nothing much," he said. "I'm getting old, David. I need someone to help me around the house." Then, without another word, he handed me a key. I took it, but deep down, I knew there was more to this than he was telling me. Uncle Ebenezer handed me the key and spoke in his usual quiet, strange voice. "It's for the tower at the other end of the house," he said. "Go up the stairs, find some papers, and bring them to me." I nodded and took the key, but something about the task felt odd. I made my way to the tower, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. The moment I entered, I realized how dark it was. There were no candles, no windows, nothing but blackness. Slowly, I climbed the stairs, feeling my way with my hands along the rough stone walls. As I went higher, a cold wind brushed against my legs. I paused. The wind. Inside the tower. I whispered to myself. The higher I climbed, the more the stairs beneath me seemed to shift, as if they were crumbling away. Suddenly, a flash of lightning lit up the darkness. In that brief moment of light, I saw something that made my heart stop. The stairs ahead were broken and falling apart. One more step and I would have fallen to my death. I stumbled back, pressing against the wall. My breath quick and shallow. Why did he send me here? I thought, gripping the cold stone tightly. Was this his plan all along? Is my uncle trying to kill me? Fear twisted inside me, but anger soon followed. Carefully, using the flashes of lightning as my guide, I made my way back down the stairs. When I reached the bottom, I pushed open the kitchen door quietly. Uncle Ebenezer sat by the fire, his back to me. He hadn't heard me return. I walked up behind him and placed my hands heavily on his shoulders. My uncle gasped and jumped, his thin body collapsing to the floor. He looked up at me with wide, fearful eyes. I said nothing. I searched the room until I found an old dagger. I took it and sat down, the dagger resting on the table beside me. My uncle slowly sat up, watching me nervously. Why don't you want to talk about my father? I demanded. Why did you give me the money? I leaned in closer, and most importantly, why did you try to kill me? Uncle Ebenezer's face turned pale. He seemed weak, trembling as he sat by the fire. I'll answer your questions in the morning, he whispered. I didn't trust him. I took the key, locked him in one of the rooms, and stayed awake, the dagger never leaving my side. The next morning, we sat at the table for breakfast. I watched him carefully, waiting for him to speak, but he said nothing. He ate in silence, as if nothing had happened the night before. Chapter 3, A Mysterious Letter and a Dangerous Plan. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. I opened it to find a young boy in a sailor's uniform standing outside. I have a letter for Mr. David, the boy said. From Captain Hosea son. He held out the letter, but before I could take it, he added, I'm very hungry. I couldn't help but feel sorry for him, so I let him inside. The boy sat down and quickly ate what was left of my breakfast. Meanwhile, my uncle read the letter carefully and then handed it to me. Your uncle and I are doing some business together, the letter explained, signed by Captain Hosea son, the captain of a ship called the Covenant. Uncle Ebenezer placed the letter down and gave me a small smile. Let's go see him, he suggested. And afterwards, we could visit Mr. Rankeeler, the lawyer. He knew your father. Hearing this piqued my interest. I had been desperate to learn more about my father, and perhaps this Mr. Rankeeler could give me the answers my uncle refused to provide. Besides, I thought to myself, if we're out in public with other people around, my uncle can't try to kill me again. I also wouldn't mind seeing the sea, I added with a shrug. Let's go. As we walked, I struck up a conversation with the sailor boy, whose name was Ransom. My uncle, as usual, walked in silence. Ransom eagerly told me about the Covenant and the men on board. He described the captain, Hosea son, as a violent man and admitted that Hosea son wasn't a very skilled sailor. Mr. Schwan, Ransom said quietly, is the one who really knows how to sail the ship. I listened carefully, realizing there might be more to this ship and its crew than I had first thought. Eventually, we reached the top of a hill. From there, Ransom pointed out the Covenant, anchored far out at sea. A small boat bobbed near the shore, ready to take people out to the ship. We made our way down the hill and entered Hawes Inn. The warmth inside was a welcome relief from the cold sea breeze. After sitting for a while, I felt the need for fresh air. "I'll step outside for a moment," I said. As I left, I saw my uncle standing near the inn, deep in conversation with Captain Hosea Sun. I lingered nearby, unsure if I should interrupt, but instead, I began chatting with the innkeeper. He leaned closer and lowered his voice. "I've heard some interesting things about your uncle," the innkeeper said. I listened carefully, sensing that whatever he was about to tell me might be very important. The innkeeper's story sent shivers down my spine. "People say your uncle, Ebenezer, killed your father, Alexander," the innkeeper whispered. "He wanted the house of Shaws for himself." I leaned in closer, my heart pounding. "So Alexander was the eldest son?" I asked carefully. "Of course he was," the innkeeper said. "That's why Ebenezer did it." I sat back in shock. My father was the eldest son. That meant I was the rightful heir to the house of Shaws, not Ebenezer. Just 2 days ago, I had been a poor boy with nothing. Now, I had a house and land waiting for me. I could hardly believe my luck. Lost in thought, I didn't notice Captain Hosea Sun approaching until he stood beside me. "Would you like to see the inside of my ship?" he asked with a friendly smile. I was curious about the Covenant, and I nodded eagerly. Captain Hosea Sun laughed. "What can I bring back for you, David?" he said. "A friend of Mr. Ebenezer's is my friend as well. My uncle." Captain Hosea Sun and I climbed into the small boat that would take us to the ship. The closer we got, the more impressed I was by its size. As we approached, Captain Hosea Sun spoke kindly, making me feel like I could trust him. I began to think he might be a good man after all. When we reached the Covenant, a rope was thrown down to pull me aboard. "David, you go first," the captain said with a grin. I didn't think twice. I grabbed the rope and was hoisted onto the deck. The captain followed soon after, but when I turned around, my uncle wasn't behind him. "Where's my uncle?" I asked, looking around in confusion. I hurried to the side of the ship. Down below, I saw the small boat already heading back toward land, with my uncle sitting calmly inside. "Help! Come back!" I shouted, my voice desperate. Uncle Ebenezer looked up at me. His cold, cruel face twisted into a smirk. That was the last thing I saw before strong hands grabbed me from behind. I tried to fight, but someone struck me hard on the head. Everything went black. When I woke up, it was dark. My head throbbed painfully, and I felt weak and dizzy. I tried to move, but my hands and feet were tied tightly with rough rope. I could feel the ship swaying beneath me as it sailed over the waves. I was confused and frightened. I had been betrayed, and now I was a prisoner. I drifted in and out of sleep, my body aching from lying on the cold wooden floor. At some point, a small man with sharp features came into the room, holding a lantern. He knelt beside me and shone the light in my face. I was too sick to speak. My head burned with fever, and I couldn't even lift my arms. The small man frowned and left, returning a few minutes later with Captain Hosea Sun. "You need to do something," the man said firmly. "He'll die if you leave him like this." Captain Hosea Sun hesitated but finally nodded. "Fine, Mr. Ryok. Cut the ropes and take him upstairs." Mr. 𝘠𝘢𝘅 took a knife and carefully cut through the ropes. Then, he lifted me and carried me to the upper deck, where he laid me down among the rest of the crew. The cool sea air brushed against my face, but I was too weak to stay awake. Once again, everything faded to black. I stayed on the ship for many days, slowly growing stronger. During this time, Ransom told me more about the Covenant and its journey. "We're going to America," he said quietly one evening. His words chilled me. At that time, white men were still sold as slaves in America. I was certain this was my uncle's plan. He had paid Captain Hosea's son to sell me into slavery. Ransom continued talking, as if unaware of the shock and fear running through me. He told me about the men aboard the ship. "Mr. 𝘠𝘢𝘅 is a good man. But only when he's not sober," Ransom said with a nervous laugh. "And Mr. 𝘓𝘢, the one who really knows how to sail the ship, well, he's dangerous when he drinks. He often hits me when he's drunk." I felt sorry for Ransom, but there was little I could do. Then one night, everything changed. Mr. 𝘓𝘢 had been drinking heavily. His eyes were glassy, and his hands shook as he stumbled across the deck. Suddenly, in his drunken rage, he lashed out, and killed Ransom. I could hardly believe what had happened. Captain Hosea's son found me later, his face cold and hard. "You'll take Ransom's place," he said, leaving no room for argument. From that moment, I was ordered to stay in a different part of the ship, alongside Mr. 𝘓𝘢. This part of the ship held the food, drink, and weapons. Later that night, the crew gathered around a table. Mr. 𝘓𝘢 sat across from me, staring at a bottle of brandy as if it were his lifeline. His hand stretched out to grab it, but Mr. 𝘠𝘢𝘅 slapped his hand away. "You've already killed a boy because you were drunk," Mr. 𝘠𝘢𝘅 said angrily. "Enough." Before Mr. 𝘓𝘓 could react, 𝘠𝘢𝘅 grabbed the bottle and threw it into the sea. For a moment, everything was still. Then Mr. 𝘓𝘓 jumped to his feet, his face red with fury. "I thought he might kill someone else, maybe even me." Captain Hosea's son stepped in quickly. "Enough," he said firmly. "Do you realize what you've done, 𝘓𝘓?" Mr. 𝘓𝘓's expression changed. It was as if the weight of his actions finally sank in. "You murdered Ransom," Hosea's son said quietly. Mr. 𝘓𝘓 collapsed back into his seat, covering his face with his hands. Later, as we sat silently, Mr. 𝘓𝘓 handed me a plate of food. "It's dirty," he muttered, his voice hollow, "but it's food." The captain led him to his bed. "Get some sleep," Hosea's son said gently. I watched as Mr. 𝘓𝘓 lay down and began to cry softly, overwhelmed by guilt and shame. From that day forward, I became Mr. 𝘓𝘓's servant. Surprisingly, I didn't mind. The work kept me busy and helped distract me from my own fears and anger. A week passed, but the weather was poor. The winds worked against us, and we made little progress. Each day felt longer than the last, and I couldn't help but wonder if I would ever see dry land again. I thought we were halfway across the Atlantic by now, far from home. But I was wrong. We were still sailing south, following the west coast of Scotland. One night, the sea was covered in thick fog. It was difficult to see even a few feet ahead. At around 10 o'clock, I was serving dinner to Mr. 𝘠𝘢𝘅 and Captain Hosea's son when a loud crash shook the ship. The plates rattled on the table as the two men jumped to their feet. "What was that?" I asked, startled. The captain hurried out onto the deck. "We've hit a boat in the fog." Someone shouted. I ran after them and stared out into the mist. The other boat had already disappeared beneath the waves, sinking with all the crew, except for one man. The crew pulled him aboard the Covenant. He was small but carried himself with pride. His clothes were good quality, and at his side hung 2 guns and a sword. He didn't look like an ordinary sailor. Captain 𝘓𝘓 and the man stared at each other for a long moment. "My name is Alan Breck Stewart," the man finally said. His voice was calm but firm. He was Scottish, and not just any Scotsman. I had heard stories about men like him. He was a Jacobite, one of the rebels who had fought against the English. Although the English had won the war, their soldiers, the Red Coats, were still hunting down Jacobites like Alan. Alan was trying to escape to France to avoid capture. "Take me to France," Alan said, glancing at the captain. Captain 𝘓𝘓 shook his head. "France? No, I can't do that," he replied. "But I can take you back to Scotland. For a price." Alan didn't look surprised by the offer. "Money?" Alan asked. "I see how this works." Captain 𝘓𝘓 smirked and sent me to the kitchen to fetch food for Alan. When I returned, Alan was sitting at the table, counting out coins in front of the captain. The light from the lantern reflected off the gold. Captain 𝘓𝘓's eyes gleamed with excitement. "Give me half of those coins, and I'll take you safely to Scotland," the captain said eagerly. Alan Breck paused and slowly gathered his money. "I can't," he said. "The money isn't mine. It belongs to my chief. I'm only carrying it for him. I can't give much of it away. But I'll give you 60 coins if you take me back to Scotland." Captain 𝘓𝘓's smile faded. "Take it or leave it," Alan added sharply. The captain leaned forward, narrowing his eyes. "Or I could hand you over to the Red Coats," he threatened. Alan smiled faintly. "That wouldn't be very smart," he said. "Those soldiers want this money as much as you do." The tension in the room was thick. I could feel danger in the air, but I wasn't sure which man was the bigger threat, Alan Breck Stewart or Captain 𝘓𝘓. Alan Breck smiled as he tucked his coins away. "60 it is," he said, shaking hands with Captain 𝘓𝘓. As the captain left, I cut some meat for Alan and placed it in front of him. "So, you're a Jacobite?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Alan nodded. "Aye. And you? I imagine you're loyal to King George." I hesitated. "I don't take sides," I replied carefully. I didn't want to upset him. Alan laughed quietly. "A wise answer, lad." He leaned back and stretched. "No more brandy left?" he asked, eyeing his empty glass. "For 60 coins, I think I deserve a drink." I nodded and left to get the key to the brandy cupboard from the captain. As I stepped outside, the fog was still thick around the ship. The air was damp and heavy. I paused when I saw Captain 𝘓𝘓 talking in low voices with Mr. 𝘓𝘢. Curiosity got the better of me, and I listened closely. To my horror, I heard them plotting to kill Alan Breck. They wanted the rest of his money and saw him as an easy target. I felt my heart pound with fear and anger. How could they be so cruel? I didn't want to be on a ship full of murderers and thieves. For a moment, I thought about running away, but where could I go? I stepped forward instead. "Captain," I called out, making them jump. "Alan Breck wants some brandy. The bottle's empty. Can I have the key to get more?" The two men exchanged a quick glance. Captain 𝘓𝘓's eyes lit up with an idea. "That's it," he said, turning to Mr. 𝘓𝘢. "David can get the guns. He knows where they are." Then the captain faced me. "Listen, David," he began, lowering his voice. "That man is dangerous. He's a threat to everyone on board. We need to take care of him before he causes trouble." I said nothing, but my heart was racing. The problem, the captain continued, is that all our weapons are locked in the room he's in. If I go in and try to take them, he'll know something is wrong. But you. He trusts you. If you slip in and take a gun or two, he won't notice. He leaned closer. Help us, David, and when we reach America, I'll make sure you get a share of the money. I won't forget it. I nodded slowly, pretending to agree. But inside, I felt trapped. I didn't trust them, but I also didn't know what to do. Alan Breck was just one man. I was just a boy. Could the two of us really stand against the entire crew? Chapter 4, The Fight. I walked back into the room where Alan was eating, my mind set on what needed to be done. Do you want to be killed? I asked him sharply. Alan quickly jumped up, his eyes wide with surprise. They've already murdered a boy, I continued. And now they want to kill you. He looked at me, fear in his eyes. Will you help me? He asked desperately. I will, I said, my voice steady despite the fear rising inside me. We quickly assessed the room for how we could defend ourselves. There were 2 doors and 1 small window. We decided to close one door and leave the other open. Alan pulled out his sword and handed me all the guns. Now listen to me, he said. How many men are there? 15, I replied, feeling a knot form in my stomach. Well, there's nothing we can do about that, Alan said calmly. I'll watch this door, where the main fight will be. You use the guns and watch the other door. I hesitated for a moment. I'm not a very good shot, I admitted. If they try to open the door, you must shoot, he said, giving me no room for doubt. I thought for a moment and then asked, what about the window? Alan looked at me, his expression sharp. Sir, how can I watch both at the same time? If I'm looking at one, my back is to the other. That's true, Alan said thoughtfully. But don't you have ears? I nodded, realizing he was right. I would have to listen closely to every sound and be ready for whatever came next. I must listen for the sound of breaking glass, I thought to myself. Exactly, Alan said, his voice calm but intense. Meanwhile, the captain was still waiting for me to return with the guns. Finally, he came to the door. Alan stopped him with his sword. What's this? Said 𝘓𝘓, surprised. I saved your life, and you show me a sword? The captain added sarcastically. I know what you're planning, Alan said, his eyes sharp. Now get your men together. I want to start this fight as soon as possible. The captain looked at me, his gaze cold. I'll remember this, David, he said before he turned away. We waited in silence, straining our ears for any sound. Then, we heard voices and the clanging of swords. After a moment, there was silence again. The weight was unbearable, making my nerves tighten. Then, suddenly, it began. The sound of footsteps and people shouting filled the air. I heard Alan shout, and then someone cry out in pain. I looked over and saw Alan strike down Mr. 𝘓𝘓 with his sword. Watch your window. Alan shouted. I turned quickly and saw 5 men running toward the other door, trying to break it down. Without thinking, I raised my gun and fired. The shot hit one of them. The others looked confused as I shot at them again, this time over their heads. Then, a third shot. The men quickly ran away. Someone pulled Mr. 𝘓𝘓's body out of the room, and Alan and I were left alone. It's not over yet, he said. They'll be back. I reloaded my 3 guns, feeling the tension in the air. We listened carefully, waiting for the next move. Then we heard a group of men charging at the door. At the same time, the glass of the window shattered, and a man crawled through it. I pushed the gun into his back, but fear froze me for a moment. He turned around and grabbed my neck, but my courage returned. I shot him. Another man was climbing in through the window. And I shot him in the leg. He fell, crashing onto the first man. I stood there for a second, watching the scene, but then I heard Alan shout for help. I turned and saw him fighting with a group of men. Even more men were pouring in through the door, swords raised. My heart sank. We're dead, I thought, but Alan charged at them, his sword swinging fiercely. With every step he took, a man fell. Suddenly, the room was empty, and the last of the attackers was running for the door. Alan chased after them, then returned, but the men kept running away from the room. There were 3 dead men on the floor, and another man lay dying near the door. Alan and I stood together, looking around at the aftermath. "We've won," he said calmly. I sat down, finding it hard to breathe. Thoughts of the 2 men I had killed overwhelmed me, and suddenly, I started to cry, like a child. "You're tired, David." "I'll watch, and you can sleep," Alan said. "You've done well." I slept for 3 hours. When I woke up, it was Alan's turn to rest. I knew there was nobody at the helm of the ship, and it was moving gently with the wind. The sound of birds outside made me realize we must be near land. I looked out the window and saw the hills of the Isle of Skye on the right. And behind us, the Isle of Rum. Chapter 5, Ship Goes Down. Alan and I ate breakfast around 6 o'clock in the morning. I didn't feel very hungry. The floor was still covered in broken glass and a lot of blood, but in other ways, our situation had improved. All the food and drink were in our room, and Mr. Riat and the captain were in another room further along the ship. Alan cut one of the silver buttons from his coat and handed it to me as a gift. "My father gave them to me," he said. "Take one to remind you of last night. Anywhere you go, show that button, and my friends will help you." Not long after, Mr. Riat and the captain came to talk to us. They looked very tired. "You've destroyed my ship," the captain said. "There aren't any men to sail it. We'll have to go back to Glasgow, but this coast is very dangerous for ships. You've killed the only man who knew how to sail it." "I've often sailed up and down this coast," Alan replied. "I'll still give you 60 coins if you take me to 𝘓𝘓. The captain agreed to Alan's proposal. They also agreed to exchange some brandy for 2 buckets of water. Both the captain and Mr. Riat were happy with the arrangement, and we cleaned up our room. When we set sail again, it was dawn, and we were navigating through the Little Minch. After the fight, we were near the Isle of 𝘚𝘌. The quickest way to 𝘓𝘓 was through the Sound of Mull, but the captain had no map of this part of the sea and was afraid of damaging his ship in the narrow channel. So, we decided to sail down the west coast of Mull, around the south, and up into the loch. This turned out to be a pleasant time aboard the Covenant. The sun was shining, the wind was good, and the mountains on the islands were very beautiful. Alan and I spent this time sharing stories with each other. But when I spoke about my friend Mr. Campbell, Alan reacted strongly. "I hate everyone with the name of Campbell," Alan said. "But he's a good man," I insisted. "Why do you hate all Campbells?" I asked. Alan then explained, "The Campbells killed people from my family, the Stuarts, and then they took their land from them. After that, I had to join the English army to make some money." I was very surprised by this revelation, especially considering how important Alan's Scottish family history was to him. "But then I deserted," Alan continued, "and now, if the Redcoats find me, they'll kill me." "So you're a Jacobite and a deserter from the English army." why are you back in Scotland? Surely it's too dangerous, I asked. I miss my friends and my country, Alan replied. But I also take money from the people in Scotland for their chief. Ari. He now lives in France, but he wants to return to Scotland. Alan explained that Ariel's half-brother, James, collected the money from the people, which Alan then took to Ariel in France. The Highlanders essentially paid twice, once to King George of England and once to Ariel. That's right, said Alan. When the Highlanders lost to the English at Culloden, Ariel had to run away and hide. The English took away all his power and his land. They also took away the weapons from the Highlanders. A Campbell called the Red Fox works for King George. He gives the king the rent from Ariel's land, but the people still love their chief and continue to give him money. The English can't stop that. But when the Red Fox heard about the money they were paying to Ariel, he became angry, and then what happened? I asked. Well, David, Alan replied, the Red Fox wants Ariel to die, so he made all the Stuarts leave their homes. Now I'll find the Red Fox and kill him. Alan's anger was palpable, so I decided to shift the conversation. How did you escape the Redcoats? They're all over Scotland, I asked. It's easier than you think, he said. If you know the countryside well, like I do, you can hide from the soldiers. There are always friends to help you. It was late at night, but since it was summer, it was still quite light. The captain came in, looking very worried. He wanted Alan to sail the ship. We went outside and looked at the sea. On one side of the ship, we saw something that looked like a fountain. What's that? Asked the captain. Alan told him it was the sea hitting some rocks. Then, we saw more fountains appear. There were rocks under the water everywhere, and it was very dangerous to sail the ship without a map to show us where the rocks were. Alan thought that there were fewer rocks closer to the land. For a while, we sailed close to the Isle of Mull and were safe. But as we came around the coast of Mull, the wind stopped, and the waves pushed the ship toward the coast. The next minute, the ship hit the rocks with a loud crunch. We all fell down on the deck. The waves grew bigger, and the ship was thrown onto the rocks again and again. Some of the men were trying to put a small boat into the sea, but it was very difficult because the sea was so rough, and waves kept breaking over us. The ship was sinking. Suddenly, one of the men cried out. A huge wave hit the Covenant, and we were all thrown into the sea. My head went under the water, and I started to sink. I came up, but immediately, I was pulled down again. I can't remember how many times I sank and came up. The waves and the wind were very strong, and it was difficult to breathe. After a while, I found a piece of wood and held on to it until I was in calm water. I looked around and saw some land not too far away. By now, I was very cold, and I knew I had to swim to land or die. It was very hard, but after an hour, I was finally on land. I lay on the beach in the moonlight, tired, but alive. Chapter 6: The Murder of the Red Fox. There was nothing on the land, no houses, no lights, just land. I was tired but happy to be alive. I did not know if any of the others survived. When morning came, I climbed to the top of a hill and looked out at the sea. There was nothing on the sea, no ship, not even the smaller boat. I looked around me and saw that I was on a small island. Nobody lived there. It was separated from the mainland by the sea, and there was no way of getting there. I was completely alone, I thought. I had nothing except a little money in Alan's silver button. I did not know much about the sea or how to survive, but I was hungry, cold, thirsty, and tired. I needed to find food. I ate shellfish from the rocks. It sometimes made me ill, but it was food. I was starting to lose hope when one day I saw a small boat with two fishermen. I shouted and waved to them, but they sailed on, saying something in Gaelic and laughing. I lay down on the ground and cried. I'm going to die on this island, I thought. But the next day, the sun was shining, the shellfish didn't make me ill, and I began to hope again. I climbed onto a rock and looked out to sea. There was the same small boat coming toward the island. I ran down to the beach. Help! Please stop! I shouted as the boat came closer. I saw that it was the same two fishermen as before, but with another man. The boat stopped. And the man started shouting to me and waving. I only understood one or two words. I heard the word tide. Suddenly, I understood. Do you mean that when the tide is low? I didn't finish my sentence. Yes, yes, shouted the man. Tide. I turned and ran to the other side of the island. I heard them laughing behind me. I saw that when the tide was low, the island was attached to the mainland. It was only an island when the tide was high. I had been there all this time when I could walk to the mainland twice a day. When I arrived on the mainland, I asked an old man for information about Alan and the other men. You must be the boy with the silver button, he said. Yes, I am, I replied, surprised. Well then, he said, you must go to Toros and take the boat from there to meet your friend in Appin. So, once again, I was traveling through an unknown country. This was the Highlands, Alan's country. There were high mountains on either side of me and dark clouds in the sky above. The people looked very poor, but they helped me on my journey. After some days of traveling, I arrived in Appin to meet Alan. I saw the redcoats of the English soldiers moving across the northern coast. I was worried because I knew they were dangerous for Alan. I also knew that Alan was somewhere on that coast, waiting for me. I started to have doubts. Was I doing the right thing? Why was I looking for Alan? He was a dangerous man to be with. Perhaps I should return to the south and leave Alan. As I sat thinking, I heard the sound of men and horses coming through the wood. Soon, 4 men with their horses appeared. The first man had red hair and looked important. I knew immediately that he was the Red Fox. From their clothes, the others looked like a lawyer, an army officer, and a servant. When I saw these men, I made my decision. I must find Alan, I thought. When the Red Fox was close, I asked him the way to 𝘚𝘌𝘓, a nearby village. Who are you? He replied. And why are you so far from your home country? He knew from my voice that I was not from this part of Scotland. I'm an honest supporter of King George of England, I told him. I'm not dangerous. The Red Fox did not believe me. We'll wait for the soldiers, he said, turning to look at the lawyer. As he turned, there was the sound of a gunshot from higher up the hill. At the very same time, the Red Fox fell to the ground. I've been shot, he cried. I'm dying. The lawyer held the dying man in his arms. The Red Fox looked from the lawyer to his servant. There was fear in his eyes. Take care of yourselves, he said to them, then sighed, and his head fell forward. He was dead. The lawyer put him down on the road. This woke me from my shock. The murderer. The murderer. I cried, and began to climb the hill. After a few minutes, I saw the murderer moving away. Not far in front of me, He was a big man with a black coat and a large gun. I can see him. I shouted. The murderer began to run. I looked back down the hill. The soldiers were there now, and the lawyer and the officer were telling me to go back. No. I shouted. You come up here, I'll give you 10 if you catch that boy, shouted the lawyer. He's working with the murderer, he said as we stopped and started talking while the murderer killed the red fox. Chapter 7, The Long Journey Home. I was confused. Things were changing so quickly, and I didn't know what to think. The soldiers began to climb the hill after me. Come in here, among these trees, said a voice nearby. I did what the voice said and heard gunshots going through the air past the trees. Just inside the trees was Alan Breck. He said nothing except, run. He started running across the mountain, and I followed him. After a while, we stopped running. This is serious, Alan said. Do as I do, for your life. At the same speed, we ran back across the mountain, but a little higher. Finally, we stopped behind some trees, breathing quickly. Alan moved first. He went to the edge of the wood and looked around carefully. Then came back. Are you all right, David? He asked. I said nothing and didn't even look at him. A man had been murdered in front of me, the man that Alan hated. And here was Alan, hiding in the trees, running from the soldiers. Was Alan the murderer, or did he order someone else to kill the red fox? My only friend in this strange country was guilty of killing another man. I didn't want to look at him. I wanted to be on my own, not hiding here with a murderer. Are you still tired? Asked Alan. No, I said, but then I added, you and I must go different ways, Alan. I liked you very much, but I don't like the things that you do. They are not my ways, and they are not God's ways. I must leave you, Alan said after a moment of silence. Do you think I killed the red fox, David? He asked. I hesitated. Well, I know how much you hated him. If I wanted to kill a man, I wouldn't do it in my own country, Alan replied sharply. We don't have much time. We need to get away from here. If we're caught, I'm in trouble because I'm a deserter, and you'll be in trouble for being involved in the red fox's murder. But I'm innocent. I protested. I'm not afraid of the law in my own country. This isn't your country, Alan said. Listen, David, the dead man was a Campbell. If they catch you, the Campbells will want someone to pay for this murder. And that someone could be you. This is Campbell law here. His words scared me. You people from the lowlands don't understand. We're in the highlands, David. When I say run, trust me and run. It was hard to run and hide in this wild land, but being locked in a red coat prison would be much worse. I'll take my chances with you, Alan, I said. It'll be hard, Alan warned, but your only other choice is death. We shook hands, and he added, now. Let's see where the red coats are. We started walking, moving quickly in the cover of the dark night. It was cloudy, making it pitch black. Sometimes we walked, sometimes we ran, pushing ourselves until I felt weak with exhaustion. At dawn, we stopped. Alan found a safe place high between two rocks, and I lay down to sleep. I was woken by Alan's hand over my mouth. Shoo, he whispered. You're making too much noise in your sleep. I looked up, confused. What's wrong? Alan went to the edge of the rock and beckoned me over. Look, he said quietly. It was now midday, and the heat of the sun was intense. From the rock, we had a perfect view. We looked down into the valley below. A river ran through it, and about half a mile up, I saw a group of red coats. I scanned the area, and to my horror, there were more red coats everywhere. "I'm afraid of this," Alan said. "They started arriving about 2 hours ago, but you were asleep. If they stay down in the valley, we'll be all right. But if they come up here, they'll see us." We decided to stay hidden in our safe spot until it got dark. Then, we could try to move past them. All day, we lay under the hot sun, but we had no water. After a while, Alan decided we had to move. We jumped down from the rock and waited in the shade, hoping to keep out of sight. The heat also made the soldiers tired, and many of them were sleeping. We crept away from our rock, moving slowly at first. By evening, we had put some distance between ourselves and the red coats. Later, we found fresh water to drink and wash with. We felt safer now, so we decided to stop and eat. We continued our journey for several days, always on the lookout for red coats and always moving south. I wanted to get to Edinburgh, while Alan needed to reach France. We were exhausted, hungry, and barely spoke to each other due to our weariness. Soon, I became very ill. I could barely walk, and my stomach ached with fever. My legs could not carry me any longer, and I had to ask Alan for help. He promised to find somewhere for me to rest. The first house we came across was familiar to Alan, and the family there knew him by name. Seeing that I was ill, they immediately called a doctor. With care and rest, I slowly began to recover. I was young and strong, and over time, I started to feel better. I stayed in bed for a week, recovering from my illness. During this time, Alan never left my side. It was incredibly dangerous for him to stay there. The red coats could have found him. Yet, he came to see me every night, hiding in the woods during the day to avoid being spotted. After a month, we felt ready to continue our journey south toward Edinburgh. Chapter 8: The Return to Edinburgh. I was feeling much stronger now, and the excitement of returning to Edinburgh filled me with energy. The only problem was that we had very little money, and we needed to move quickly. We arrived at the River Forth and had to figure out how to cross it to reach Edinburgh. There were still many soldiers there, making it a tricky situation. Luckily, Alan managed to find a boat to take us across to Queensferry, near Edinburgh. Morning came, and now I had to find Mr. Ranker, the lawyer. I needed to speak with him about my father and my inheritance. I also had to tell him about my uncle Ebenezer's plan to kidnap me on the Covenant and send me to America. Alan decided to wait until sunset to meet me again. If all went well with Mr. Ranker, I could give Alan the money to help him get to France. I arrived in Queensferry and began searching for Mr. Ranker's house. Doubts crept into my mind. Would I find it? Would Mr. Ranker believe me? What if he refused to help me? I walked up and down the street, trying to gather my courage, when I finally stopped in front of a beautiful house. Just then, the door opened, and a man came out. "Can you tell me which house is Mr. Ranker's?" I asked. "Well," said the man, "it's the house I've just come out of." "I am Mr. Ranker, sir," I said. "May I speak with you?" He looked at me curiously. "I don't know your name or your face," he replied. "Who are you?" "My name is David Balfour, sir," I said. "David Balfour," he repeated, sounding surprised. We went inside the house, and Mr. Ranker asked, "How can I help you?" "I am the son of Alexander Balfour. Mr. Ebenezer Balfour is my uncle, and I believe that the House of Shaws is my inheritance," I said. We sat down, and I shared everything that had happened. He told me about the events in Edinburgh and the lies my uncle had spread about me. When I mentioned Alan's name, Mr. Ranker paused and suggested, "It's probably a good idea to call your friend, Mr. Thompson. It's for his own safety." Afterward, Mr. Ranker gave me some clean clothes, and we continued our conversation. He told me the story of my father and Uncle Ebenezer. Both brothers had fallen in love with the same woman. After much fighting, the lady rejected them both. More arguing followed, and they eventually made a decision: one brother would have the lady, and the other would get the house. It was a bad decision for everyone. Said Mr. Ranker. Your mother and father lived and died poor, and your Uncle Ebenezer became hated by all. He turned selfish and dangerous, as you've seen for yourself. Then what is my position now? I asked. The law says that the house is yours, he replied. But I believe your uncle will fight you for it. Your uncle paid Captain 𝘚𝘌 to kidnap you, right? We need to prove that your uncle was responsible for this. If we can do that, he'll have to give you the house. This sparked an idea in my mind, and I began to think of a plan. I told Mr. Ranker about it, but, "I have to meet your friend Mr. Thompson," said Mr. Ranker. "I think so, sir," I replied. He asked me many questions. But I could tell he liked my plan. In the end, he agreed to it. Around sunset, we left the house, met Alan, and walked down to the house of 𝘓𝘢's. Alan knocked on the door, and Mr. Ranker and I hid nearby. My uncle opened the door. "Who are you, and what do you want?" he demanded. "Who I am is not important," Alan replied. "I need to talk to you about David." Alan told my uncle that he had locked me up in a room, and he explained, "The law says this is David's house, but I can help you. I know you have money. You must either pay me to kill David or pay me to keep him away from you. You choose. How much do I have to pay?" My uncle asked, "How much did you pay 𝘚𝘌?" Alan pressed. "He's my partner, you know, so don't lie to me." "Well, I don't care what 𝘚𝘌 told you," my uncle said, "but I gave him 200. That's the truth. But he was going to sell the boy in America as a slave to get more money for him." Mr. Ranker stepped forward. "Thank you, Mr. Thompson," he said. "That will do nicely. Mr. David, you have admitted to the kidnapping of your nephew. Shall we go inside? I think we need to discuss a few things." Finally, my uncle had to give me my inheritance, the house of 𝘓𝘢's. Now it was time for Alan to continue his journey. We both felt very sad. He had been a great friend to me, and we had gone through so much together. As we walked along, we did not speak. I gave him the few coins I had with me so that he could get something to eat on his journey. He held out his hand. "Well, goodbye," he said. "Goodbye," I replied. I held his hand tightly, then let go and walked away. My adventures with Alan were over, and a new life was about to begin. If you enjoyed the story and want to say thank you, you can subscribe to our channel and visit it. Chapter 1, Health Problems. There were 4 of us: George, William Samuel Harris, myself, my friends call me Jay, and Montmorency, my dog. We were sitting in my room, smoking and talking about how sick we felt. All of us were feeling unwell and unhappy about it. Harris said he sometimes felt dizzy. George said he felt dizzy too. As for me, I was sure my liver was the problem. I knew I had a bad liver because I had read all about liver disease in a book. Every symptom the book mentioned, I had it. The truth is, whenever I read about an illness, I immediately felt like I had it. One day, I had a small health concern, so I went to the British Museum library to read about it. But while reading, I stumbled upon a description of another illness. I don't remember the name now, but it sounded terrible. As I read more, I became convinced I had that illness too. Curiosity got the better of me, and I began reading the entire medical book from A to Z. By the end, I realized I had symptoms of every disease listed, except for one. I didn't have housemaid's knee. This actually made me feel a little disappointed. Why didn't I have housemaid's knee as well? It seemed unfair to have every other disease but not that one. With all these illnesses, I felt certain my life would be short. I started examining myself. I tried to feel my heartbeat and checked my tongue in the mirror. When I had walked into the library, I had been a happy and healthy man. By the time I left, I felt like the sickest man alive. I decided to visit my doctor, an old friend of mine. Every time I thought I was sick, he would examine me and tell me I was perfectly fine. I believe doctors must get a lot of practice by dealing with people like me, but this time, I thought, he's going to get more practice with me than with 1,000 normal patients. After all, normal patients only have 1 or 2 diseases at most. "Well, what's wrong with you now?" he asked, smiling. I sighed. "Doctor, if I tell you everything that's wrong with me, you'll die before I finish. Life is too short. I'll tell you what's not wrong with me," I said. "I don't have housemaid's knee. But I have everything else." I told the doctor all about what I had read at the library. He listened carefully, checking my heart and looking at my tongue. After examining me, he smiled and wrote something on a piece of paper. "Here's your prescription," he said, handing it to me. I put it in my pocket and left without reading it. I took the paper straight to the chemist. The chemist looked at the prescription, then handed it back. "I can't help you with this," he said, "but you're a chemist, aren't you?" I asked. "Yes, sir," he replied. "I'm a chemist, but I don't run a shop and a hotel." Confused, I unfolded the prescription and read it. It said, "Every 6 hours, 1 pound of good fresh meat, a pint of beer every morning, a 10-mile walk each day, go to bed no later than 11 o'clock, and stop reading books about things you don't understand." I followed the doctor's advice, and to my surprise, it saved my life. I started feeling much better, though I still believed I had a problem with my liver. The main symptom of liver disease, I told myself, was feeling sleepy and having no interest in work. I had suffered from this condition since I was a boy. Back then, medical science wasn't very advanced. Doctors didn't realize I had a liver problem. They simply thought I was lazy. People used to call me a lazy little devil and told me to get up and do my work. They didn't know I was ill. Instead of giving me liver pills, they gave me a smack on the head. And strangely enough, those smacks worked better than any medicine. After each one, I somehow found the energy to get things done. That evening, George, William Harris, and I sat in my room again. We spent most of the time describing our illnesses. I told them how terrible I felt in the mornings. Harris explained how awful he felt at night. Then George stood up dramatically to tell us how miserable he felt all the time. George always believed he was sick, but honestly, there was nothing wrong with him. Just as we were getting deeper into our health complaints, Mrs. Poppets, the housekeeper, brought in our dinner. We weren't very hungry, but we ate a little, some meat, onions, and cake. Still, none of us enjoyed the food. Before long, we were talking about our illnesses again. We all knew why we felt so ill. It was because of too much work. "We need a rest," said Harris. "A rest and a change," added George. "Our minds are too tired from all this work." "We must rest our minds. Let's go to the countryside," I suggested. We can find a quiet place with no people, Harris frowned. Oh, how boring. In the countryside, everyone goes to bed at 8 o'clock. You can't even find a newspaper. If you really want rest and change, he continued, the best place is the sea. What a terrible idea. I said. A trip on the sea will only give you seasickness. Who wants a whole week of that? You leave on Monday feeling well. By Tuesday, you feel worse. On Wednesday, you're really sick. Thursday and Friday, you're half dead. By Saturday, you can drink a little tea. On Sunday, you can finally eat again. And on Monday, you're happy because it's time to get off the boat. George thought for a moment. Then let's go up the river, he said, we'll have fresh air and peace. The work we do on the boat will make us hungry, so we'll enjoy our food. And at the end of the day, we'll be so tired that we'll sleep like babies, Harris laughed. George, you never have trouble sleeping. There are only 24 hours in a day, and you sleep for most of them. If you slept any more, you'd be dead. Still, Harris nodded. But I like the idea of a holiday on the River Thames. I liked the idea too. George was surprised that we both agreed with him. The only one who didn't like the plan was Montmorency, my fox terrier. He looked at us with his big, round eyes. You like the idea, but I don't. His face seemed to say, on the river, there's nothing for me to do. I don't care about trees. I don't smoke. If I see a rat, you won't stop the boat so I can chase it. And when I'm asleep, you'll probably rock the boat and I'll fall into the water. The whole thing is stupid, but there were 3 of us, and only one Montmorency. So, we decided that a river trip it would be. Chapter 2, Planning the Trip. We spread out the maps and began discussing our plans. After some thought, we decided to start from Kingston the following Saturday. Harris, you and I will go to Kingston to get the boat, I said. We'll take it up the river to Chertsey, where we'll meet George. George worked in the city and couldn't join us until the afternoon. George's job, as I often say, is quite simple. From Monday to Friday, he sleeps at a bank from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. The only difference on Saturdays is that they wake him up at 2 p.m. and politely show him to the door. The next thing we had to decide was where to sleep at night. George and I agreed, we didn't want to stay at inns. We wanted to camp out in nature, surrounded by peace and beauty. How perfect it will be, we said. Sleeping in the open, under the stars, by the river, I could picture it all in my mind. Imagine, I began, a golden sunset over the water. The river flows quietly, reflecting the soft light. The forest around us hums with life, birds singing in the trees, the fresh green grass beneath us, and little flowers peeking through. I continued, painting the scene. Soon, the sky darkens. We gently row our boat to a quiet spot on the riverbank. We set up our tent and cook a simple, healthy meal. Sitting around a small fire, we eat together under the glow of the moon and the stars. Everything is silent except for the soft sounds of nature. I smiled at the thought. We'll go to sleep, dreaming under the stars, dreaming of a world that feels young and full of wonder. As George and I sat there, lost in our dreamy visions, Harris broke the silence. But what if it rains? He asked. That was Harris for you. There's nothing poetic about him. Harris is as practical as they come, certainly not the romantic type. If Harris ever has tears in his eyes, it's usually because he's cutting onions. Harris isn't the type to get lost in poetry or emotions. If you stand by the sea and say, listen to the waves. Can you hear the spirits singing sad songs, the songs of those who drowned in these waters? Harris will simply pat your arm and say, I understand, my friend. You're not feeling well. Let's go around the corner, I know a place where you can get some good whiskey. You'll feel better soon. Harris always knows where to find good whiskey. As much as Harris lacks romance, he was right about one thing: camping out in the rain is miserable, just imagine. It's evening, and you're soaked to the bone. Water is everywhere, in the boat, in your clothes, even in your sandwiches. You finally spot a place on the riverbank and get out of the boat. The first thing you do is drag out the tent. Two of you try to put it up. The tent is wet and heavy, and the rain won't stop. The wind picks up, blowing the tent around until it flops right over your head. You pull it off, grumbling angrily. Putting up a tent is hard even on a sunny day. Doing it in the rain feels impossible. To make matters worse, the other man helping you is completely useless. The tent keeps flapping, the rain keeps falling, and frustration grows. What are you doing with your side of the tent? You shout, I'm not pulling. You're pulling. He yells back, stop pulling on your side. I didn't pull. You pulled. Why are you messing this up? I can't hear you over the wind. You don't know how to put up a tent. We'll never get this thing up. Meanwhile, the third man, who was busy pulling the boat out of the water, walks over, completely drenched. He stares at the chaos and asks, why isn't the tent up yet? Now everyone is wet, cold, and furious. Harris was right. Camping in the rain is not fun. In the end, we decided to camp in good weather but stay at inns or hotels if the weather turned bad. Montmorency fully agreed with this decision. He loves inns and hotels. Montmorency doesn't care much for the quiet life. He prefers noise, excitement, and as much chaos as possible. When you look at Montmorency, you might see a sweet, well-mannered dog, an angel in the form of a small fox terrier. Old ladies adore him. They often get misty-eyed, saying, what a lovely little dog. But Montmorency is no angel. The moment he killed 12 chickens, and I had to pay for them, I saw him in a new light. In 1 year alone, Montmorency got into 14 street fights with other dogs. Once, an angry woman even brought me her dead cat and called me a murderer. Montmorency enjoys hanging around with the roughest dogs he can find. Together, they roam the streets, looking for trouble and picking fights. This, to Montmorency, is the perfect way to spend a day. Chapter 3, Packing. The next evening, we met again to continue planning our trip. Now, said Harris, we must decide what to take with us. Jay, get a piece of paper. George, get a pencil. I'll make the list. That was Harris for you, always the one giving orders while doing nothing himself. He reminded me of my old Uncle Podger. Uncle Podger was exactly like Harris. Whenever Uncle Podger took on a job, the whole house ended up involved. I remember one day Uncle Podger bought a picture. Where shall we hang this picture? Asked Aunt Podger. Leave it to me, said Uncle Podger confidently. Don't worry about a thing, I'll handle it all, and that was when the trouble began. First, Uncle Podger sent one of the girls to buy nails. Then he sent one of the boys to run after her and tell her the exact size of the nails. Bill, he shouted. Go get me the hammer. Tom, fetch the ruler. Now, Jim, get me a chair from the kitchen. Soon, the whole house was running back and forth, searching for tools. Maria, hold this chair steady for me. Uncle Podger called. Tom, shine the light here. And someone pass me the nail. Finally, Uncle Podger stood on the chair, nail in hand, ready to begin. But just as he was about to hammer it in, the nail slipped and fell to the floor. "Where's the nail?" "I just had it," he grumbled. We all got down on our hands and knees, searching every corner of the room for that tiny nail. By the time someone found it, Uncle Podger had lost the hammer. "Where did I put the hammer?" "Has anyone seen the hammer?" he asked, growing frustrated. When we finally handed him the hammer, he couldn't remember the spot where he was supposed to hang the picture. "Now, where was that place?" he mumbled. One by one, each of us climbed onto the chair to search for the exact spot on the wall. Naturally, everyone pointed to a different place. Hanging that picture became a family event, one that none of us ever forgot. When Uncle Podger finally climbed onto the chair, he managed to fall right onto the piano. Aunt Podger was furious. "The next time you want to hang a picture," she said, glaring at him, "please tell me. I'll go and stay with my mother for a week." But Uncle Podger wouldn't give up. He climbed back onto the chair, determined to finish the job. By midnight, the picture was finally on the wall. It wasn't straight. The wall was covered in marks and scratches. Everyone was exhausted and unhappy. Uncle Podger stood back, proudly admiring his work. "That was such an easy job," he said, wiping his hands. "I told Harris, you get the paper and pencil, George will write the list, and I'll do the work." We started making a list of what to pack, but the first list was ridiculously long. We threw it away and started over. George pointed out that since we were traveling along the upper part of the River Thames, we'd need a small boat. "With a small boat, we can only bring the essentials," George said. "No heavy tent. We can just put a canvas cover over the boat at night, like a little floating house. Warm and comfortable." That sounded like a good idea. We made a list of the clothes we'd need. George claimed to know everything about the right clothes for a river trip. Later, we discovered that wasn't exactly true. Next, we talked about food. "Let's start with breakfast," George said. "We'll need a frying pan." "A frying pan is very difficult to eat," Harris said, grinning. "Stop being ridiculous, Harris," I said. "Yes, let's keep going," George continued. For breakfast, we listed tea, sugar, eggs, bacon, bread, butter, and jam. For lunch, we decided on biscuits, cold meat, and fruit. "But absolutely no cheese. The smell of cheese gets everywhere," George warned. "After a day or two, everything will smell like cheese." For dinner, we chose meat pies, fruit pies, tomatoes, and green vegetables. "This kind of food will keep us healthy," George said confidently. We decided not to take any wine or beer. "They just make you sleepy," George explained. George continued, "We'll also need a teapot, a pan, and a camping stove. We're not taking a paraffin oil stove," I said firmly. George frowned. "Why not?" I shook my head. "We took one once, never again." The smell of paraffin was everywhere. The river smelled of paraffin, the wind smelled of paraffin. Even the sunset smelled like paraffin. George and Harris laughed. When we got to Marlow, the whole town smelled of paraffin. The church smelled of paraffin. And I swear the countryside for miles around smelled like it too. We decided right then, no more paraffin oil stoves. The next day, we bought everything we needed for the trip. That evening, we met to pack. We had one large suitcase for the clothes and two big hampers for the food and utensils. "I'm excellent at packing," I told George and Harris confidently. "I'll organize the packing." "Good idea," George said, settling into the armchair. Harris nodded and put his feet up on the table. "This was not what I meant. I wanted to organize the packing. not do all of it myself, but I didn't say anything. I sighed and started packing the clothes. It took forever, but at last I was done. I sat on the suitcase to close it. Harris watched me lazily. "Aren't you putting the boots in?" he asked. I froze. "The boots? I had forgotten them. Why didn't you tell me that before?" I snapped. Harris shrugged. George burst out laughing. I was furious. I opened the suitcase, packed the boots, and began closing it again. Then a terrible thought hit me. Did I pack my toothbrush? I opened the suitcase again and began searching. I found George's toothbrush. I found Harris's toothbrush. But no sign of mine. By the time I unpacked everything, I finally found my toothbrush, inside one of the boots. I packed everything again. When I was finally done, George asked, "Is the soap in the suitcase?" "I don't care about the soap," I said through gritted teeth. I sat on the suitcase to close it. Just as I finished, I remembered, my cigarettes were in there too. I groaned, opened the suitcase for the third time, got my cigarettes, and packed everything back once more. At exactly 10:50 p.m., the suitcase was finally closed. Now there were just the 2 hampers left to pack. "Don't worry," Harris said. "George and I will handle these." I sat down and watched, eager to see them struggle for a change. Chapter 4. Chaos and Packing. Montgomery's idea of fun. There were dishes, cups, bottles, pans, tomatoes, cakes, and far too many other things to pack in the hampers. As soon as George and Harris started packing, they broke a cup. And that was just the beginning. George is the worst packer in the world. When George dies, Harris will take his place as the worst packer in the world. They stepped on things and broke them. Harris placed a large jar of jam on top of a tomato. Naturally, the tomato was crushed. George accidentally stepped on a big packet of butter, and Harris sat on it. Soon, there was butter everywhere. They packed the pies carefully into the hamper, and then immediately placed heavy things on top of them. The pies ended up looking just like the crushed tomato. In the middle of this chaotic scene was Montmorency, of course. At one point, he dipped his leg into the sugar. Soon, there was sugar all over the floor. He ran off with the teaspoons and refused to give them back. When he found the lemons, Montmorency decided they were rats. He killed 3 of them, proudly scattering lemon peels around the room. This was Montmorency's idea of fun. At 1 o'clock in the morning, we finally finished packing. We were exhausted and ready for bed. "What time should I wake you up?" George asked. 7, Harris said. 6, I added. "Wake us up at 6:30. We both agreed. The next morning. It wasn't George who woke me, it was Mrs. Poppets, our housekeeper. "Do you know it's nearly 9 o'clock, she said. "What?" I shouted, leaping out of bed. I woke Harris and George in a hurry. We rushed to get ready, and then remembered we had packed our toothbrushes the night before. Getting them out of the suitcase was not an easy task. At last, we were dressed and sat down to eat breakfast. While we ate, George read the newspaper. He told us stories about people who had drowned in the river and gave a full report on the terrible weather forecast. A cheerful start to the day. George went to work, and Harris and I finished breakfast. That morning, Montmorency invited 2 of his friends to the house. They spent most of the time fighting. When we were finally ready, we carried our luggage out to the road and waited for a taxi. We waited for 20 minutes. Taxis usually came every 3 minutes. A crowd gathered to watch us. They looked at us. They looked at Montmorency. They looked at Montmorency's friends. And they looked at our luggage, which included a big suitcase, a small bag, 2 large hampers, some pans, several umbrellas, 5 coats and raincoats. We looked like we were moving house. At Waterloo Station, we caught the 11:05 train to Kingston. When we arrived in Kingston, our boat was waiting below the bridge. Harris and I loaded the luggage into the boat and climbed in happily, but Montmorency seemed worried. Harris took the oars, and our 2-week adventure on the River Thames began. Harris wore a red and orange blazer, and the sun shone brightly. We were thoroughly enjoying ourselves. As we passed Hampton Court Palace, Harris turned to me and asked, "Have you ever visited the maze here?" He then told me a story about the time he visited the maze with a friend. Before going in, Harris had studied a map of the maze carefully. He was certain it was easy to get out. "Look," Harris told his friend, "we'll go in, walk around for 10 minutes, and then come out and have lunch. It's simple, just take the first right turn every time." It seemed like a foolproof plan. However, inside the maze, they soon met some people who had been wandering for 45 minutes. They were lost, and desperate to get out. Harris, with confidence, said, "Follow me. I'll be out in 10 minutes. Relieved, the people followed him. As Harris continued, more people began to follow him. Some of them looked worried, some looked downright afraid. Harris continued to turn to the right in the maze, but he still couldn't find the way out. The people began to get angry with him, and they started calling for help. A young keeper heard them and came to assist, but he got lost too. Finally, the old keeper came back from lunch and let everyone out. Everyone was tired, frustrated, and angry. Harris, trying to make light of the situation, said, "Let's ask George to try the maze on our way back." "Not a bad idea," I agreed. We continued down the river. When we passed Mola Lock, we were the only boat in the big lock. Normally, on Sundays, the lock is packed with boats. People love the river and the sun. It's such a beautiful sight, the river, the trees, the flowers, and people in their colorful clothes. As we passed Hampton, Harris wanted to stop the boat and visit the church. I'm not fond of visiting churches, but Harris loves it. "I came on this trip because I wanted to visit Hampton Church," he said. "You know how much I love churches, churchyards, and tombs. The thought of missing Mrs. Thomas's tomb makes me angry." "Who's Mrs. Thomas?" I asked. "I don't know," Harris replied, "but she has a strange tomb. We must stop and see it." We soon continued, and Harris began to grumble again. "We're supposed to be at Shepperton by 5 o'clock to meet George," he said. "Why can't George be here to help with this heavy boat? What does he do at the bank? He just sits behind a piece of glass all day and does nothing. I'm working hard. Why doesn't he help?" Harris was growing increasingly irritable, so I suggested, "Let's stop for a drink." "Good idea," he replied. "Where are the pubs around here?" I asked. "There are none nearby," I said. "The nearest pub is far away." "What?" Harris exclaimed. "We'll all die of thirst with no pubs around." "If you're thirsty," I said, "there's water in the boat." "Water?" Harris groaned. "Water makes people ill." "I am very thirsty," he said, grabbing the bottle. He took a swig of water, but his face showed how much he disliked it. Chapter 5, First Day on the Boat. The trip begins. We stopped at Kempton Park and had lunch under the trees. Good food always calms Harris, so we all relaxed a little. By 3:30, we reached Sunbury Lock, and from there we continued on to Walton, a historical town. Julius Caesar had stayed there with his soldiers, and Queen Elizabeth I had also visited. It seemed impossible to escape from her, as she seemed to be everywhere. Next, we arrived at Hoard and Shepperton. There's a tomb in the 𝘚𝘌𝘅 churchyard with a poem on it, and I feared that Harris would want to stop and visit. I saw him eyeing the church as we passed, so I quickly moved the boat. In the chaos, Harris's cap fell into the water. He fished it out, visibly angry with me. Fortunately, he became so preoccupied with his wet cap that he forgot about the church. As we approached Weybridge, the first thing we noticed was a colored blazer. We soon realized that George was wearing it. Montmorency began barking furiously, and Harris and I shouted loudly. George waved his cap and shouted too. The lock-keeper rushed out, thinking someone had fallen into the water, but when he saw that no one was in trouble, he returned to his work. With George finally on the boat, we decided it was time for him to contribute. I had a bad day at the bank, George complained. Harris, who could be a little cruel, replied, well, now you're going to have a bad day on the river. A change is good for you, it's healthy. Come on, get out of the boat and tow. George hesitated but finally said, it's better if I stay here and prepare tea. It's difficult to prepare tea, and you look tired. We didn't respond. Instead, we handed him the rope, and he reluctantly climbed out of the boat to start pulling it. I recalled an amusing moment when George had once seen a young couple walking by the river. They were pulling a rope behind them, chatting away, but didn't realize there was no boat at the end of the rope. The young couple probably had a boat attached to the rope when they started, but it had likely drifted away. When George saw this, he pulled the rope out of the water and tied it to his own boat. As a result, the young couple ended up towing George and his 3 fat friends up to Marlow. When they looked back, they saw they were towing a boat that wasn't theirs. The young man was both surprised and angry, while the young woman exclaimed, "Oh, Henry, where is Aunt Mary?" No one knew what had happened to Aunt Mary. One of the more exciting experiences was letting girls tow your boat. It required 3 girls, 2 of them held the rope while the third one ran around and laughed the whole time. They would start pulling, but they'd pull the boat too quickly and tire out. They'd stop to rest on the grass, laughing, but during this time, the boat would drift toward the middle of the river. Oh look, the boat's gone to the middle of the river. They'd laugh, jumping up to start pulling again. After a while, one would stop to fetch her hat, another would look for her red shawl, and yet another would search for a comb for her hair or a handkerchief. This continued for most of the afternoon, and it never seemed to get boring when 3 girls were towing a boat. Finally, George towed us to Penton Hook, where we decided to spend the night on the boat. We found a lovely spot and tied the boat to a big tree. We were all hungry and eager to eat, but George insisted, no, let's put the canvas cover on the boat first. It'll only take a few minutes. It seemed simple enough, but it turned out not to be. There were 5 metal rods that had to be inserted into special holes on the side of the boat. I didn't think the task of putting on the canvas cover would be dangerous, but it certainly turned out to be. I'm honestly surprised we're still alive to tell the story. At first, the metal rods didn't go into their holes. We jumped on them, kicked them, and pushed with all our might. Once the rods were in place, we tried to spread the canvas cover over the boat. George took one part of the cover and tied it to the front of the boat, while Harris stood in the middle, trying to help George with the cover. George was doing fine, but Harris was utterly confused. After about 10 minutes of hard work, Harris ended up inside the cover, struggling to get out. In the process, he accidentally knocked George down, and now George was inside the cover too. The 2 of them fought to free themselves, and I heard some very unpleasant words being exchanged. I thought the job must be incredibly difficult. But I didn't understand what was really happening. George and Harris had told Montmorency and me to stand at the back of the boat and wait quietly. We obeyed and stood there, watching the cover move violently. We assumed this was the correct method for putting it on, but after a long struggle, we heard George shout, "We can't breathe under here. Why don't you help us, you idiot?" Whenever someone calls for help, I always respond. So, I went to help them, and poor Harris. His face was almost black from the lack of air. Chapter 6, Harris makes scrambled eggs. As soon as the cover was in place, we started to prepare supper. We needed some hot water to make tea, so we put the kettle on the stove. However, we pretended that we weren't interested in the water. We wanted it to think we didn't care about it. The trick to getting water to boil on a boat, we thought, was to act as though you were indifferent to it. If the water knows you are waiting for it, it will never get hot. We began preparing supper, trying to distract the water. "I don't want any tea, do you, George?" I shouted. George replied, "Oh no, I don't like tea. I'll have milk instead." Then Harris chimed in, "Tea is terrible. I never drink it. I'll have lemonade." This made the water very angry, and at that point, it finally boiled. We were starving, and that supper was exactly what we needed. For the next 35 minutes, nobody said a word, we simply ate and ate. Finally, our bellies were full, and we were happy. A full stomach makes you feel kind and generous, so we smiled at each other. Montmorency got his share too, and we smiled at him as well. Afterward, we lit our pipes and started talking. We went to bed at 10 o'clock, but I didn't sleep well. The boat wasn't exactly comfortable, and I kept tossing and turning. I woke up at 6 o'clock the next morning, and so did George. There was no real reason to wake up that early, we were on holiday. After all, why had we woken up so early? It never happened to us when we were working. We decided to wake up Harris, but this was no easy task. We had to use an oar to help us. Harris moved a bit and said, "I'll be downstairs in a minute. Get my best boots ready, please." We tried again with a boat hook. Suddenly, Harris sat up, and Montmorency fell off the bed. We pulled up the canvas cover, and all four of us looked out at the river. We were freezing. We had planned to go swimming, but the water looked so cold and uninviting. "Well, who's going swimming first?" asked Harris. Nobody wanted to be the first to take the plunge. George decided to get dressed. Montmorency barked in horror at the idea of swimming. Harris went off to look for his trousers, and I decided to go to the riverbank and throw some water on myself. I held on to the branch of a tree as I moved closer to the water. It was incredibly cold, and I quickly decided not to go in. Just as I turned to head back to the boat, the branch I was holding onto broke, and I fell into the river, along with my towel. To make matters worse, I drank about a bottle of river water. Good heavens! Old Jay is in the water! Harris exclaimed. "How's the water?" George asked. "It's lovely," I replied. "Why don't you come in?" But nobody wanted to try the water. When I finally made it back to the boat, they were all still shivering on the shore. I was freezing. I wanted to put on my shirt, but it fell into the river. This made me furious. George started laughing. "I don't see anything funny," I said, but George just laughed even harder. I had never seen anyone laugh so much. I was cold and angry, trying to fish my shirt out of the river. George's laughter grew louder, and I shouted, "Stop laughing, you stupid idiot." When I finally managed to pull the shirt out of the water, I realized it wasn't mine, it was George's shirt. I started laughing too, so much that I dropped the shirt back into the river. "Aren't you going to get it out?" George asked, still laughing. I didn't answer at first because I was laughing so much. Finally, I managed to say, "It isn't my shirt, it's yours." George's face changed instantly. "What?" he shouted. "You donkey! Why can't you be careful with things? Go and get dressed on the riverbank. People like you don't know how to live on a boat." I tried to explain how funny it was, but George didn't get the joke. He can be a bit slow on the uptake sometimes. Meanwhile, Harris announced, "I'm cooking scrambled eggs for breakfast this morning. Once people try my scrambled eggs, they always want more." He was quite famous for his scrambled eggs. George and I got the stove and the frying pan ready, then searched for eggs that weren't broken. "We found only 6, now you can start," we said. Breaking the eggs was a challenge for Harris. They ended up on his trousers and all over his arms. He finally put 6 eggs into the frying pan, sat down by the stove, and mixed them with a fork. George and I could see that it was difficult work. Harris often burned his fingers, and when he did, he danced around the stove, waving his hands in the air and shouting. George and I thought this was an essential part of his cooking method. We didn't really know what scrambled eggs were, we thought they might be some sort of Native American food. To cook them properly, we assumed it was necessary to perform special dances accompanied by magic words. Montmorency, curious as always, went to put his nose over the frying pan and burnt himself. He, too, began dancing around and barking. It was quite an entertaining spectacle, and George and I were sorry when it was over. When the scrambled eggs were finally ready, there was hardly anything to eat. 6 eggs had gone into the pan, but all that came out was a teaspoonful of burnt eggs. "The problem is the frying pan," Harris said. "I need a different kind of pan and another stove." We decided not to try scrambled eggs again until Harris had the right equipment. Chapter 7, The Laughing Tin. When we finished breakfast, the sun was up, and it was a warm morning. I sat on the riverbank near Runnymede, thinking about King John, who signed the Magna Carta there in 1215. What a great moment in English history! I imagined the scene. George came over and said, "When you finish resting and dreaming, please help me wash the dishes and other things." I cleaned the frying pan with some grass and George's wet shirt. Later on, we went to Magna Carta Island, where we saw the stone where the Magna Carta had been signed. In this area, King Henry VII also met with his sweetheart, Anne Boleyn. I'm sure they met in several other places too. We continued slowly up the river and stopped for lunch near Monkey Island. We had cold meat for lunch. "Where's the mustard?" I asked. "The mustard?" Harris said. We forgot to bring the mustard. At that moment, we all wanted mustard more than anything in the world. "How boring life is without mustard," said George. We ate our cold meat in silence, thinking about the happy days of childhood when there was always lots of mustard on the table. The adult world can be a cruel place. All 3 of us loved tinned fruit. George brought out a tin of pineapple, and this was perfect to make us forget about the mustard. We felt that life was smiling at us again. "Look at the picture on the tin," said Harris. "Ah, I can't wait," I said. "I'm dreaming about the sweet juice." George said. Harris got a spoon ready. Then we looked for the tin opener. We took everything out of the 2 hampers, we emptied every bag, and we looked in every corner of the boat, but there was no tin opener. Harris tried to open the tin with a little knife and cut himself. George tried with a pair of scissors, and the scissors flew up and almost cut his eye. I tried with a piece of metal, but I did something wrong and fell into the river. The tin flew away and broke a teacup. Then we all got angry. I started hitting the tin with a piece of wood. Harris hit the tin, and so did George. We changed its shape, we made it square, then round, and finally flat, but we still couldn't open it. The tin looked at us and seemed to be laughing. It was ugly, and it frightened us. I threw it into the river, and then we rowed away, not stopping until we reached Maidenhead. It was evening, and a strong wind started blowing. The wind was behind us, and we quickly put up the sail. The wind blew, and the boat flew up the river. I was steering the boat, and George and Harris were enjoying the trip. Sailing is exciting, it's almost like flying. You feel that you are part of nature. We were alone, flying along the river. Far in the distance, we saw a small fishing boat with 3 fishermen in it. The sun was going down, casting a red light on the water. The river seemed magical, it was like a dream. We felt that we were sailing into a strange land. But we didn't sail into a strange land, we sailed straight into the fishing boat with the 3 old fishermen. At first, we didn't know what was happening, but when we heard the bad words coming from the other boat, we knew we were near people. We also knew that those people were not happy. The 3 old fishermen fell off their seats, and fish were all over them. They slowly tried to get up, and as they did, they cursed us. They didn't curse us with common curses. They used long, special ones. They cursed our parents, families, friends, neighbors, pets, and jobs. These curses were for both the present and the future. Harris stood up and said, "Be thankful for a bit of excitement in your lives. Your lives must be so boring, just sitting and fishing all day. My friends and I are very unhappy to hear men of your age use such bad words." The 3 old men did not agree with Harris. "I'll steer the boat now," said George. "An intelligent man like you must do better things. Leave the steering to me before we all drown." Chapter 8, Montmorency Meets a Cat. At Marlow, we left our boat by the bridge and spent the night at the Crown Hotel. The next morning, we went swimming before breakfast. On the way back, Montmorency met a cat. Montmorency and I don't agree on cats. I like cats, but Montmorency doesn't. When I meet a cat, I stop and say hello. I pet it gently, and the cat is happy, and so am I. But when Montmorency meets a cat, the whole street knows about it. A lot of bad words fly through the air. As soon as Montmorency saw the cat, he barked with happiness. The cat was walking slowly across the street, but Montmorency ran after it. The cat didn't run, it didn't understand that its life was in danger. This cat was big and black. It had half a tail, half a nose, and only 1 ear. It was a clever street cat. Montmorency is a courageous dog, but the cold eyes of that cat terrified him. The cat stopped in the middle of the road and looked at Montmorency. Neither spoke, but the conversation was probably something like this: "Cat, yes, you want me? Can I do anything for you?" Montmorency: "No, no, thanks, cat. If you really want something, please tell me." Montmorency starts walking backwards. Montmorency: "Oh no, not at all. Don't disturb yourself. I'm afraid I made a mistake. I thought I knew you. Sorry, I disturbed you, cat. Not at all, it's a pleasure. Are you sure you don't want anything? 𝘚𝘌𝘍𝘍, still walking backwards. No thanks, nothing at all. Thanks, very kind of you. Good morning, cat, good morning. The cat got up and walked away. 𝘚𝘌𝘍𝘍 came back and followed us quietly, remaining silent all day long. To this day, if you say the word cats to 𝘚𝘌𝘍𝘍, he'll stop walking and then look up at you as if to say, please don't. After this, we did our shopping, returned to the boat and continued our trip up the river. At Hambledon Lock, we discovered that we had no water. We went to the lock keeper to ask for some. George spoke for us with a friendly smile and asked, may we have some water, please? Lock keeper, certainly, take as much as you want and leave the rest. George, thank you very much. He looked around. Where is the water, lock keeper? It's where it always is. Behind you. George turned around and looked confused. I don't see it, lock keeper. What, where are your eyes? He took George's arm and turned him around. George, oh, lock keeper. But you can't drink the river. George, no, but you can drink some of it, said the lock keeper. I drank river water for the past 15 years. Well, sir, I don't think you look very healthy after drinking all that river water. But thank you anyway, George said. We left the lock keeper's place and found some water at another house. We towed the boat past Henley and stopped near Wargrave for lunch. We were sitting in a green field near the river. Harris was cutting a meat pie while George and I were waiting with our dishes. I need a spoon, said Harris. The hamper was behind us. George and I both turned around to get a spoon. In 5 seconds, we had the spoon. When we turned back, Harris and the meat pie were gone. Disappeared. It was a wide open field, and there were no trees nearby. Harris did not fall into the river because it was far from us. George and I looked all around, then we looked at each other. Has he gone up to heaven? I asked. Angels don't take meat pies to heaven, George said. You're right, I agreed. Then there has been an earthquake, George said. I'm sorry, he had the meat pie with him. Sadly, we looked at the place where Harris and the meat pie had been sitting. Then, with horror, we saw Harris's head. Only his head. It was in the grass. His face was red and furious. George was the first to speak. Say something. Are you dead or alive? Where is your body? Oh, don't be an idiot. Harris shouted. I think you made this happen. You told me to sit there. It's your stupid joke. Here, take the pie. Harris didn't know it, but he had been sitting next to a big hole. The long grass had covered it. He fell into the deep hole without knowing anything. At first, he thought that it was the end of the world. Harris still thinks that George and I planned it all. Chapter 9, Fighting Swans. After lunch, a gentle wind pushed us up the river past Wargrave and Ship Lake. We got out of the boat at Sunning and walked around the village. Sunning is a lovely village. Everything is clean and beautiful, with each house covered in roses. We decided to return to one of the Ship Lake Islands to spend the night. George said, let's have a special supper tonight. Let's make an Irish stew. We can put everything into one big pan. What a wonderful idea. Harris and I said. I'll get the wood and make a fire, George said. You two can peel the potatoes. This turned out to be a very big job. We were happy and excited, but when we peeled our first potato, we understood that this was not exciting, it was hard work. The first potato we peeled looked like a pea. George looked at it and said, "No, no, no, there's no potato left. Do it like this." We worked hard for half an hour, but we had peeled only 4 potatoes. We refused to continue. "Well, just put the potatoes in without peeling them. Let's add some carrots and other vegetables. Look in the hampers and take out all the pieces of old food. We'll put them in the stew." You can put anything in a stew. We found half a pork pie, a tin of fish, and a few broken eggs. We added these to the stew. Montmorency watched us carefully, then left. After a while, he returned with a dead rat in his mouth. Wanting to add something to the stew too. We discussed it first. Harris said, "It's all right to add the dead rat. It will be mixed with the other things." "A stew needs many ingredients," George said. "Well, I don't want to try anything new. Maybe next time." "I'm sorry, Montmorency," Harris replied, "if you never try anything new, you'll never discover things. It's men like you, George, who slow down the progress of our world." George didn't listen to Harris. The stew was a great success. It was delicious, excellent in every way. We all really enjoyed it. After the Irish stew, George and I decided to go to Henley for an evening walk. Harris wanted to stay on the boat and drink whiskey. When we returned to the boat, Harris was sad and confused. "What happened to you?" we asked. "Swans," he said. We had left the boat near a swan's nest. When George and I were in Henley, Mrs. Swan came back to the nest and started to shout at Harris. Harris frightened her away, and she went to get her husband, Mr. Swan. Harris had a terrible fight with these 2 swans. He finally won the fight. However, half an hour later, Mr. and Mrs. Swan returned with 18 other swans. There was a horrible fight. The swans attacked Harris and tried to pull him off the boat. They wanted to drown Harris and Montmorency. Harris fought with courage for 4 hours, but in the end, the swans slowly swam away to die. How many swans were there? George asked. 32, said Harris, who was sleepy. "But you said 18 before," George said. "No, I didn't. I said 12. Do you think I can't count?" Harris replied, "We never discovered the truth about the swans." We asked Harris about it the next morning, and he said, "What swans?" He thought George and I were dreaming. That night, Harris had trouble sleeping. He woke me up about 12 times. Looking for his clothes. George woke up too. "Why do you need your trousers?" "It's the middle of the night," George asked. Later, Harris was looking for his shoes, then his socks, and even his umbrella. We woke up late the next morning, had a small breakfast, and were ready to go. We agreed that we would row the boat and not tow it. Harris said, "George, you and Jay can row. I'll steer." I didn't like this idea and said, "No, Harris, you and George row so that I can rest. I'm doing too much work on this trip. I always think that I work too much. It's not because I don't like work. I love it. I find it very interesting. I can sit and look at it for hours. You can't give me too much work. I like collecting it. My office is full of it. I'm very careful with my work too. Some of the work in my office has been there for years. It is in perfect condition, it isn't dirty or anything. That's because I take good care of it," Harris said. "On this boat, I'm the only one who works," George said. "You do nothing but eat and sleep, Harris." "I'm the only one who works." You and Jay are very lazy people. Harris laughed and said, George work. Have you ever seen George work? I agreed with Harris. George never worked. How do you know if I work? George said. You're always sleeping except at mealtimes. Have you ever seen Harris awake except at mealtimes? George asked me. I agreed with George. Harris worked very little on the boat. Oh please, I do more work than old Jay, Harris said. Well, it's difficult to do less work than old Jay, George added. Old Jay thinks he's a passenger and doesn't need to work, Harris said. After this discussion, I said to Harris, you and George row the boat up to Reading. At Reading, I'll tow it. Chapter 10, 3 Men Out of a Boat. We reached Reading at about 2 o'clock. The river here is very dirty, so we moved on to Streatley. We stayed at Streatley for 2 days. We took our clothes to a laundry woman. We had tried to wash them in the river, but as George told us, the river was so dirty that our clothes collected all the dirt from the water. The river became cleaner, but our clothes became dirtier. The laundry woman was very surprised to see such dirty clothes. She looked at them and said, this will cost you 3 times the usual price. We agreed and paid her. The river near Streatley and 𝘚𝘌𝘢 is excellent for fishing. It is full of different types of fish. Some people sit and fish there all day. However, they never catch any fish. The local fisherman's guidebook doesn't say anything about catching fish, it only says that the place is a good fishing area, and it is. You can see many fish swim past, but you can't catch them. When you go for a walk by the river, you can see hundreds of fish. They come and stand half out of the water with their mouths open for bread. If you go swimming, they come to look at you and disturb you. You cannot catch them. We passed by Wallingford and Dorchester, both ancient British towns. In the days of the Roman Empire, the Romans camped here and built fortifications. We spent the night at Clifton Hampton, which is a pretty village. We finally arrived at Oxford and spent 2 excellent days there. Oxford is a beautiful town with its old university. Oxford is also full of dogs. Montmorency was very happy. He had 11 dog fights on the first day and 14 on the second day. He probably thought he was in heaven. We left Oxford on the 3rd day to return home to London. When we left Oxford, it was raining, and the rain continued without stopping. When it's sunny, the river is a dream, but when it's rainy, the river was brown and unfriendly. It rained all day. At first, we pretended to enjoy it. Well, this is a nice change. Too much sunshine is boring. Nature is beautiful even when it rains, I said. Yes, Harris agreed. It's good to see the river in all kinds of weather. The rain is good for you. I can't understand people who are afraid of a little rain. Harris and I sang songs, and we were quite happy. George did not agree, he stayed under the umbrella. We put up the canvas cover before lunch, leaving a little opening to see where we were going. We continued our trip for another 9 miles and stopped for the night at Days Lock. We did not have a happy evening. The rain never stopped, and supper was not good. We were really tired of cold meat and dreamed about our favorite foods. Harris talked about fish cooked in a special sauce. Harris gave his cold meat to Montmorency. Montmorency looked at it and turned his head, seeming insulted by Harris's offer. He went to sit at the other side of the boat alone. Please, don't talk about good food until I finish this cold meat, George said. We played cards after supper, and then we had some hot water and whiskey. George told us about a man he knew. This man had slept on the river in a wet boat like ours and got very ill, dying 10 days later. Of course, we began talking about other illnesses. After a while, Harris said, "I've got an awful headache. It must be the rain." "Well, I've got a bad backache," I said. Trying to make us feel happier, George sang to us, which made Harris and me cry, and it made Montmorency howl. There was nothing else to do, so we went to bed. We didn't sleep well at all and were awake at 5 o'clock the next morning. Our second rainy day was the same as the first, it rained all day. We moved slowly along the river and agreed to continue our trip, even if it killed us. "It's only 2 more days," Harris said. "We're young and healthy. Maybe we'll be all right." We talked about our evening. "With this weather, we can have dinner and take a walk in the rain, or we can have dinner and spend an hour in a pub," I said. "That's not very exciting," said George. "It's much more interesting to go to the Alhambra Theatre in London," said Harris, "and then have supper at that little French restaurant," I added. "But we've decided to stay and die on this boat," said George. "However, there's a train that leaves Pangbourne after 5 o'clock. It gets to London in time to eat something and then go to the theatre." Everyone was silent. We didn't say a word. We looked at one another, then got out the big bag and got our clothes ready. 20 minutes later, 3 men and a dog were going to the railway station. We lied to the boatman at Pangbourne. We didn't have the courage to tell him the truth. We were running away from the rain. We asked him to take care of the boat until the next morning, saying, "If something happens, we'll write to you," telling him a big lie. We reached Paddington Station at 7 o'clock, went directly to the restaurant, and had a small meal. Montmorency stayed at the restaurant while we went to the theatre. "We'll return at 10:30 for the dog and a good supper," I said. The man at the ticket office of the theatre said, "Oh, you're the famous acrobats from the Himalayas. You're late for the performance. Please use the side door." We explained to him that we were not acrobats. And he understood and sold us 3 tickets. Our clothes probably looked a bit old and strange. At the Alhambra Theatre, everyone looked at our clothes and smiled. Some people laughed. After the theatre, we went back to the restaurant and enjoyed our delicious supper. After 10 days of eating cold meat, we were thankful for this supper. We ate it without speaking, then sat back and felt happy and kind. Harris, who was sitting next to the window, pulled back the curtain. He looked at the wet street. It was rainy and dark, the wind was blowing, and a few people walked past under their umbrellas. Harris took his glass and said, "Well, we had a good trip, and I say thank you to old Father Thames, but I think we were right to come back when we did. Here's to 3 men well out of a boat." Montmorency stood on his back legs in front of the window, looked at the wet street, and gave a short bark of agreement.